We are going to talk about the challenges in quantifying urbanization and some of the uh, you know questions around urbanization that come up in our research practice work. And um, a lot of the content that I'm going to walk you through today is from different people's work. It's not all my work. A lot of it is from the Urban Informatics Lab that I'm a part of at IIHS. Some are also from our collaborators from the Geospatial Lab, and also um, many other people across the institution and outside as well. So let's begin by uh, thinking a little bit about what quantitative methods do, where are they useful, especially for those of you who may not have used these and may not have been very familiar with quantitative data methods, etc., in your work. So, if you think about it with an example, suppose you are somebody who is studying childhood malnutrition. So you are probably measuring the height and weight of children and looking at, you know, whether they are growing at sufficient rate as prescribed by organizations like the WHO. And think about having the data for one child, right? So you have height, weight, etc. For one child. You basically measure, quantify um, these indicators, these parameters, versus having the data for several children, many children, who may be different in their height, weight, etc. So think about in which case quantitative methods may be meaningful, may be useful for your research, for your practice, any kind of inquiry you are interested in pursuing, right? So I think it should be evident that it's when we talk about aggregate phenomena is when quantitative methods are more useful, and that is when quantitative data, quantitative methods are used generally. And some of the different purposes of using this kind of methods and data is to, for example, describe distributions that you kind of see in your study population, irrespective of whether you're studying humans, economies, trees, clouds, any entity that you're interested in, right? So you would probably quantify, measure to describe, how certain parameters, certain indicators are distributed across the population. You would also probably be interested in, group and subgroup level relationships, and beyond the description, you also often want to understand, what kind of processes and systems give rise to the data that you're measuring, right? So that's another purpose. And sometimes you also want to predict. You want to kind of use the data, use your methods to make certain claims, certain statements about what happens in a future time, or in an unseen location. In some case where you haven't collected the data, you want to predict what may happen, right? So these are typically the kind of scenarios where quantitative methods are very useful. Now, with that background, let's now step into today's topic. These are some of our guiding questions for navigating the content for today's discussion, which is broadly trying to understand urbanization as a process, urban transition over time in India, right? So if you're doing anything in the urban space in India, you are quite likely to be in a situation where you're asking some of these questions, if not everything, right, in some form or the other. So how much of India is urban? You can replace India with a state or a district or some geography. You also probably want to understand in a deeper sense how urban areas differ from rural areas, right? So you want to sort of qualitatively understand how urbanization is changing the society, the economy, the environment, etc. And study the patterns over time, for example. You are sometimes interested in the characteristics of a particular city in certain situations, right? And you also probably want to understand the nature of the city, how much of the city has neighborhoods that are similar to each other, how much of heterogeneity is there, what are the processes that give rise to some of these patterns that you see, and so on. Sometimes you are asking questions on growth. You want to understand how fast our cities and towns are growing. You want to make comparisons with which urban areas, which towns, which cities are growing faster than the others, and so on, right? So these are broadly the kind of inquiries, the kind of questions that lead us to some of these methods and data that we are going to talk about today. So keep this background in mind, where we apply some of these quantitative methods, and in the context of urbanization in India, what are the kind of broader questions that we are trying to answer using these methods, right? And at IIHS, when we work on some of these questions in the context of different projects, we we use various data sets. Sometimes we, in fact, very often we find data gaps, and then we have to think hard about what can we do if the ideal kind of data sets are not available, and so on. And that is the story I'm hoping to kind of share with you today. So to start with, let's spend a little bit of time thinking about urban versus rural as a binary classification, right? This is a topic that has been extensively written about, and I'm guessing some of you may be familiar with it. For the others, a quick background on what this implies. In India, when you say urban, that includes, the first segment of that would be statutory towns as categorized by the state governments, right? So these are towns that are administered as towns, so and cities. So it has some form of urban local body, and it's recognized by the government, typically the state government, as an urban area. Then another source of this binary classification of urban rural is the census of India. So census typically, census has been in the recent rounds using three parameters to classify settlements into urban and rural. It's basically population density, and the share of non-agricultural workforce. Share of people, it's actually males in the non-agricultural activities in the labor force. So let's step back and think about why we need to do this urban and rural classification, and should it be a binary classification, right? So for practical purposes, for administrative purposes, not just India, most other countries do this kind of a classification because a lot of you know, schemes, administrative structure, and other kind of interventions by the state depends on whether a certain area is classified as urban and rural. And that is also followed in India. And you can always ask a question on whether it should be such a binary classification and what kind of parameters should go into classifying certain areas as urban and rural, etc. And this has been a topic of a lot of academic debate, and some of these methods of classifying settlements into urban rural also are quite consequential. So it has political implications. It has been controversial in some cases, the decision to transition certain rural areas into urban areas. Like the people living there probably may not want it in certain cases because it changes what they get from the government. So this is a quick summary of how sensitive some of these thresholds are. So if you look at the census 2011 data, the fraction of population in the country that lives in areas that are classified as urban is around 32%. Of course, now we would expect that it would have increased by a little bit. But even for 2011, if you tweak these definitions, like population density, and the workforce criterion, we see that this extent of urbanization kind of changes quite a bit. This is one such example. So we just changed the threshold of non-agricultural worker fraction from 75 to 50%, and the population threshold from 5,000 to 4,000. And on the right-hand side, the plot shows how much more urban all these states and union territories would be if we were to use the other criteria. You can see the red lines are all showing the fraction of population in urban areas according to the modified criterion. So you can see that certain states like Pondicherry, Goa, Kerala would become almost entirely urban under this modified criteria. So it's like even this binary classification of urban and rural can be quite context dependent, can be subjective sometimes, can be controversial, and so on. And like before we get more deeper into certain patterns that show urban rural differences, I just wanted to lay out the fact that the classification itself is something you may have to look at carefully depending on what you want to do with it, right? As a quick example, this is a map from our recent work looking at urbanization trends in Rajasthan. And what you see as the red dots are all cities and towns in Rajasthan that were recognized, administered as urban areas in 2011. And the green dots are all towns that the census identified as what they call the census towns, which means they have these settlements, these localities have the characteristics of urban areas, but they are administered as rural, right? They don't have urban local bodies. So you can see that the green dots are spread almost all over the state. There are many such small towns that technically have become urban-like, but they are governed as rural. So this was important for us because we were proposing a relatively long-term strategy for managing urbanization, and in that context, it was very important that we recognize these places as urban-like and include them in the policy imagination, right? So again, it depends on what you actually want to do with the data, and sometimes you may have to be careful about what kind of definition you're using to classify something as urban and rural. Are there alternatives to classifying settlements into this binary? There are. It's not widely used yet for practical purposes, especially for administrative purposes, because of the complexity involved in it, right? In really using these different kinds of settlements. So this is one example coming from a global data set published by the European Commission. It's called Global Human Settlement Layer, and they have a categorization of every 1 square kilometer grid on the planet that puts these cells, grid cells, into various urban-rural categories. You can see, as an example, in this area, the categories are urban center, dense urban cluster, semi-dense urban cluster, suburban grid cell, rural cluster, low density, very low density, etc. So basically, it's not just looking at the administrative boundaries and population density, etc. This data set is actually looking at the spatiality of the neighborhood as well. So, for example, the yellow dots, yellow areas that you see, these are recognized as suburban, right? Which typically gets missed out in a census type of classification. And also another important thing is that we don't have these boundaries here, right? So we don't have the administrative boundaries here. It's a continuous classification. So we'll come back to the spatial nature of urban-rural in a bit, but I just wanted to flag that there are alternatives to the binary definition of urban and rural, and depending on what you want to do, this might be a source of classification you would consider. Now, let's think of what we want to say about urban-rural, right? So once we agree on the classification, and for now, let's say we agree that a binary classification will do for our purposes. So we classify the entire country as, urban kind of settlements and rural kind of settlements. And then we can study their differences, how they change over time, etc. We can talk about what happens in the urban, what happens in the rural, once you draw the boundary. And this is one such thing, again, from our earlier work. Here, we are talking about the workers by age and employment status. This is compiled from the census and national sample survey to national scale data sources. And this may be a bit complicated if you're not used to this kind of charts. But basically, one of the key patterns that comes out immediately is that the upper part of the plot, which is urban, is kind of skewed to the left if you focus on the red area in the middle, right? So the left-hand side is male and right-hand side is female. And you can see that the female share, which is the dark red part of the chart in the middle, is relatively much smaller in the urban half, the upper half, compared to the lower half, which is, I'm imagining, which is a phenomenon that most of you are familiar with, which is like the much lower female labor force participation that we see in our cities, right? So this is an aggregate look at what is happening in our in our employment situation in the entire country, and how urban areas differ from rural areas in terms of participation in the workforce, right? And we also have this age breakup, so we can carefully look at what kind of differences exist between age groups, etc. So this is a kind of inference. It's a kind of understanding we can draw once we have urban and rural classification. So we are broadly saying urban areas have this kind of a pattern and rural areas have this kind of a pattern, right? And for that, data sets like the census, national sample surveys are all good. So they are sufficient to answer these kind of questions. This is another quick example. This again from the census 2011 data. The x-axis is the population, share of population living in urban areas, and the y-axis is percentage of women aged 15 to 19 who had at least one live birth, which is basically like indicating very early childbirth, right? Very early age childbirth, and each dot represents a district in the country, right? And like if you go back to what we discussed right at the beginning, so our aim is to look at the data and describe certain patterns, and then think about the processes, systems, etc. that give rise to these patterns. So this is one such pattern that really stands out when you look at the aggregate data, right? So we can see that as the urban population fraction increases, there is a steady decrease in the fraction of very early stage childbirth. Let's move on. This is another example for a pattern that comes from the National Family Health Survey data, fourth round of it. This is from a project where we were looking at stunting percentages in the administrative areas in Karnataka. Stunting is basically very low height for age in children below 5 years. And this NFHS is a sample survey like the national sample surveys. It's not a census. They don't enumerate every single household. NFHS is one of the largest surveys. Actually, it is, I think, literally the largest survey done all over the country in terms of the sample size, right? So then we are able to draw inferences at a quite regional scale. So we are talking about administrative regions in Karnataka, 4 administrative regions, and within them, how much do urban and rural differ, right? So we are now able to make these statements about what is the difference in urban and rural in a relatively small geography, even below state level, from these national scale data sets. This is another quick example from National Sample Survey again, 75th round, consumption expenditure, monthly per capita expenditure in Haryana. The rural is the bluish color, and orange is urban. We can see clearly how the upper deciles, the x-axis shows the deciles of the population, like each 10%, lowest 10% of the population is D1, and the highest 10% in terms of MPCE is D10. And we can see how the difference increases as we go to the higher income, higher consumption expenditure brackets. So here again, the objective is to show you that these kind of national scale data sets can actually talk about state level urban-rural differences. Right now, so far we have talked about what these large scale data sets can tell us, some of the patterns, right? So like these, there are several questions they are very good at answering. Now let's pause for a minute and think about the spatial scales of administrative units, geographical units that we might want to consider when we're working on some of these problems, right? So just to give you a sense of the scale, we have a series of these maps. The first one, the number one, is I hope you can see my mouse. This one is the state of Karnataka and all the districts within it, and the highlighted region is what is treated as one unit by the National Sample Survey, and that is now highlighted here. And within this, the small red boundary that you see is the Bangalore Urban District. It's a district, and within the district is what we typically call as the city, which is the Bangalore metropolitan area. And within that, we have wards. This blue animal-like shape that you see in the middle is a ward in the Bangalore city. And then within the wards, there are enumeration blocks, right? So there are small neighborhood level blocks. So this is the kind of spectrum of spatial scale that we are talking about. In some cases, you want to have patterns. You want to describe patterns at the ward level. In some cases, you want to do it at the state level, and everything in between, right? So now, let's spend a moment thinking about what kind of these boundaries, which of these boundaries that we just saw, are you interested in? Especially if you want to work on a particular city. If your question, if your line of inquiry is limited to one city, and if you want to study what's happening within one city in detail, or sometimes you want to compare two cities. So in all these cases, a broad comparison of how urban is different from the rural in Karnataka or in the NSS region or the entire country wouldn't be sufficient, right? So you want to go down to the next spatial scale and think about what are the patterns I can find, what are the relevant data sets at this spatial scale. And this spatial scale is what we want to call a city, right? But the tricky thing here is that a city can mean different things for different people. And that poses great deal of challenges sometimes in, deciding what kind of data is available, preparing the correct scale of data set, and things like this. So as a quick example, what you see on the screen is the city of Chennai. The thinner boundaries in this reddish patches, inner boundaries, are different ULBs, different urban local bodies, that the census classified as an urban agglomeration. So one way of the census to recognize a larger urban area than what may be represented by the boundary of administrative area is to kind of put together all the spatially contiguous, the ULBs that are next to each other, everything in a collection called urban agglomeration. So the reddish area that you see in the middle of this map is the Chennai urban agglomeration as recognized by the 2011 census. And in fact, in the 2011 during 2011, the city corporation was only the inner thinner boundary that you see. So only this area. And now the greatest Chennai corporation has been expanded until this thick black boundary. So it's a different, even if you are talking about the Chennai corporation, it has now expanded. It was different in 2011, right? And then to add to the complexity, there are sometimes planning authority jurisdictions that you have to keep in mind. The dotted red line is the Chennai Metropolitan Authority until recently, and they have now expanded their jurisdiction to the very outer thick red line, a huge area that is almost 6,000 square kilometers. So when you talk about the city of Chennai, like unless you really think carefully about which Chennai you are studying, it may be quite difficult to even think about what data set is appropriate, right? So right from the inner boundary that was the city corporation in 2011 to this huge area that is now called Chennai metropolitan area, there is a spectrum of sizes, and of course this has a lot of implications in different kind of quantitative decisions that you take. Now again, like the urban definition, if you decide which city, which Chennai or which Bangalore, which Delhi you want to work on, there are some data sets that are readily available, and in some cases having access to data at that spatial scale is tricky. So I'll quickly walk you through some of the data sets that are available to us. So this is from one of our colleagues, an earlier work that shows the spatial heterogeneity in the city of Bangalore, and the Bangalore that we use here is BBMP, the Bruhat Bangalore metropolitan area, Mahanagarapalike. And what this visual shows is different clusters based on ward level census data. So it kind of the method picks different variables from the census data and categorizes wards into high socioeconomic town, average town, low socioeconomic worker town, low socioeconomic town, these four categories, right? And this is using various indicators from the census, like the number of rooms, assets, roof quality, female literacy, household size, SC population, total workers. So this is at this spatial scale, data is available in the census, right? But if you want to do an analysis that is more recent, unfortunately, that's not possible because we don't have the census. This is another quick example, taking the economic census that happened around 2013, and similar to the ward level socioeconomic conditions that I just showed, this shows the employment characteristics at an enumeration block in the city of Bangalore. Right? On the right-hand side, the red areas are where manufacturing is concentrated, and the bluish areas are where service industries are concentrated. So these two were large-scale national-level data sets. They are available for an earlier time. The new rounds have not been published. And now, if you want to study cities and go into neighborhood-level characteristics, especially in the absence of ward level or EB level, enumeration block level data from the census, economic census, etc., you are left with thinking hard about what other alternative data sets we have access to. This is one such example where we had to do sample surveys in Chennai and Bangalore. We wanted to identify different kinds of neighborhoods for the purpose of sampling for the survey, and this is a method developed by the Geospatial Lab here at IIHS, looking at the street hierarchy, the nature of street network in different neighborhoods, and also looking at a lot of satellite imagery, identifying the density of built structures, the amount of vegetation, etc., and combining all these things into a way to categorize neighborhoods. And you can see that the green areas are high income, high affluence kind of neighborhoods, and the yellows are medium, and the low are categorized as low income, low socioeconomic kind of areas. So this type of classification is possible from non-traditional data sets. Another challenge when you work on cities, when you want to understand the structure of the cities and the inner differences of the cities, is that population data is old, right? The best you can get is census 2011, and a lot of our cities have undergone so much change. And fortunately, there are several global data sets that map population at a pretty fine resolution. So this is an example from a source called WorldPop that has released population numbers, disaggregated population numbers for the entire world. And this is a part of India that covers Bangalore in the middle and Chennai on the right-hand side. So this is a 1 square kilometer data. They also have 100-meter resolution data, like a better resolution data. So with these kind of sources, it is now possible to see what is the kind of change in population from 2011 and how population density differs across neighborhoods in the cities, etc. At the city level, if you're working at the city level, if you want to understand what's happening within cities, of course, another source is surveys, right? And in many cases, if you are working on a problem, you may not have the resources to go and do a survey on your own. Some projects do have the resources to do that. Otherwise, another option may be to see if somebody else has already done a survey and then seeing if you can access their data. So this is a relatively recent survey that covered the NCR area in Delhi, like this, there are not many city level surveys. So this map on the slide shows which areas in Delhi they have sampled, right? The greener ones are darker green areas are where they have a higher concentration of samples, and so on. So talking about alternative data sources, like when you're studying cities, another important thing to understand how cities are changing, apart from the population and density changes, would be migration, right? And that's another big data void. There is some migration data that is available in the census 2011, which is unfortunately quite outdated, and the spatial resolution of that data is not great. It doesn't tell you within a city where migrants are. This is one example of a recent, actually 2016-17 economic survey showing patterns from train passenger information about across state migration. This is of course not at a city scale, but alternate data sets looking at train passenger flows, mobile networks, etc., have been used to study migration. This is another example from South America, where they have looked at Google Street View images to classify neighborhoods that had a higher concentration of informal activities, right? Informal economic activities. And we can see that they've kind of mapped out the hotspots of informal economic activities, which is kind of a amazing spatial resolution considering what other data sources are there. Like practically there's really no other data set at this spatial scale. We'll quickly move on to another example, which is a crowdsourced data example. At a city neighborhood level, this project called Missing Basti has mapped out evictions from slum areas across the city of Delhi, right? So we can see different categories of evictions from across the geography, and a lot of this data is from volunteers. It's crowdsourced, cleaned, and aggregated by a team of volunteers. So this is another possibility for you to kind of get access to really fine resolution data. So we don't have a lot of time left. Let's quickly talk about one more point, which is very important when you think about urban problems, especially when you have to plan for like a few years ahead for anything you're studying. It could be a master plan kind of a process. It could be thinking about how much extra waste a city may generate, how much extra energy the city may require, etc. Right? So which is basically all a growth question. But when you think about city level growth, the tricky thing is that we are talking about a moving target, because if you remember the Chennai boundaries that I showed you, which city, which Chennai are you talking about, right? So the city boundaries change over time. So is that the growth you want to capture, or are you talking about just population growth, right? So depending on the context, growth may have different meanings, different implications. So I wanted to quickly show you one curious example. So this is a tweet from The Economist a few years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago, showing that some of the Indian cities, especially relatively small cities and towns from Kerala, are the fastest growing, right? So they appeared, in their top 20 or something, there were several Kerala towns that appeared as like fastest growing, right? So what does it really mean? Why, like, these are not places that we would imagine to be fastest growing urban centers. So when we looked at the possible explanation, what we found is that because of the process census follows, there are, boundary expansions that happen over time, and different areas sort of do a different pace of catching up the urban expansion. Some of the ULBs proactively expand their boundaries and say that, okay, like 10 years from now, these areas will become urban, so we redraw our boundaries to include those. So something of that sort happened. If you see the plot in the middle, a couple of districts, couple of cities in Kerala had a huge jump in their area, geographical area, while the population hadn't grown proportionately, right? So it was basically the redrawing of the boundaries that resulted in them being identified as fastest growing, right? So, of course, it's one definition of fastest growing, but is that what you, it's whether it's relevant for the problem you are you want to address is a question. Another kind of a perspective on urban expansion is this is an example taken from the Atlas of Urban Expansion. So this is an effort by the NYU, New York University, and UN Habitat to map out several cities and their spatial expansion, primarily using satellite imagery. So you can see in Pune how much of a spatial expansion has happened. I believe this is from 2001 to 2011, roughly around that timeline. And we can see that the northern side of the city, Pimpri Chinchwad, was kind of spatially separated earlier. Now it has become essentially practically one city, right? So that kind of a expansion has happened. So this is not using the boundaries. So when you forget the boundaries and like purely look at spatial expansion from satellite imagery, you get a slightly different picture, and this is another perspective. This is another way of quantifying urban expansion. I'll stop here. Like I tried to explain earlier, definitely there's a lot of overlap between what I have walked you through and what we teach in the UFP. So thank you very much for staying on the session, and looking forward to seeing some of you at least in class in the next batch.